Almighty Father in heaven, in the name of your Son, our glorious and victorious Savior, Jesus Christ, we humbly ask for your blessing upon our worship of you on this, your holy and sanctified Sabbath day, so that we may grow more in our knowledge of you, our love for you, and our obedience to you. Praise ye the Lord. I will praise the Lord with my whole heart in the assembly of the upright and in the congregation. The works of the Lord sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. His work is honorable and glorious, and his righteousness endureth forever. He hath made his wonderful works to be remembered. The Lord is gracious and full of compassion. He hath given meat unto them that fear him. He will ever be mindful of his covenant. He hath shewed his people the power of his works, that he may give them the heritage of the heathen. The works of his hands are verity and judgment. All his commandments are sure. They stand fast forever and ever, and are done in truth and uprightness. He sent redemption unto his people. He hath commanded his covenant forever. Holy and reverend is his name. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all they that do his commandments. His praise endureth forever. Amen. Today is sermon number 497 overall. Sermon 86 of our ongoing complete reading of the Holy Bible, the King James translation. We have just completed with the last sermon the book of Nehemiah. We are about to begin today the book of Esther, and we're actually at a point now as far as the history of the land of Israel, or the land of Judah, which is what it became. We're at the end of the Old Testament as far as the recorded events and the recorded history of Israel, which ends with the return from the Babylonian exile, as we've just been reading in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's all there is as far as the history of Judah until the beginning of the New Testament. And that's sort of amazing, considering we've still got a lot of the Old Testament to read. But as far as the history is concerned, Ezra and Nehemiah are it. That's all there is. Because there's about a 3-century gap between the end of the events of the so-called Old Testament. And keeping in mind that that's really an unfortunate term, because a lot of the Old Testament hasn't happened yet. The prophecy has not happened yet, so it can hardly be dead and gone away, done away as so many people think of it. But the fact is, the laws are themselves the very basis of salvation, for the link for that. But as far as being the end of what established Judah, or was about to establish Judah for what it is today, what it became, that was it at the time of the return in terms of Ezra and Nehemiah. The time of Ezra and Nehemiah. For the next 3 centuries, they grew as a nation. They never became a great nation as in the time of Solomon or the time of David. They hung together, but they had their problems again. They very soon became, keeping in mind the restoration of the kingdom itself was under the Persians, which we'll read here, which is when Esther was there. Actually, she was a queen that we'll get to, a queen of what is known today as Iran, and how all of that came about. But they returned. They became subject again to the various kingdoms. Persia eventually fell. Then came the Greeks, and they peaked during their time. Alexander the Great and the Seleucids up in Syria, the ones who committed the abomination of desolation, which triggered the Maccabean revolt, which created Hanukkah, as we'll cover with the link on for those studies. And the Ptolemies down in Egypt, Cleopatra, the most famous one at the end, which became the final stand of the Greek Empire, if you will, because when they lost, Cleopatra and Mark Antony, the very famous naval battle, fell to the Roman forces. Rome then grew from a republic, an aggressive republic, to an empire, and that's oftentimes what happens in history. But as far as Israel is right now, Israel itself We were actually long done with that because the northern 10 tribes of Israel were gone. The people of Judah were Israelites, but they were not Israel as in what became the kingdom of Judah. They still call themselves that, and they do rightfully so even to this day, even though I'll put on the link for the study, Israel of Judah, because really that's what it is. And if you look at actually what David Ben-Gurion read that day, that statement of the establishment of the modern day, present day, he almost called it Judah, and he could have, and been totally accurate. Surely he knew Israel's history very well, or Judah's history, and he could have called it that, and that's really what it is. Because as far as Israel coming back, they haven't yet. And I mention that simply because there are two different kingdoms. There are two different religions. There are two different people. If the people of Israel, such as they were from that time, were to meet someone of Judah in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, or someone from Judah today, they would be so foreign to each other, so foreign that they would almost be incompatible as a matter of their religion, as a matter of their nationality. Israel, the northern 10 tribes, never knew Purim, as we'll get to, which was established in the time of Esther, we'll cover today, or begin today in the reading of Esther. They never knew Hanukkah, because that happened to the people of Judah during the intertestamental period, between the end, as we said, about three centuries, between the end of the Old Testament record, not the Old Testament era, but the Old Testament record as we're written, and the beginning of the New. That entire time was not recorded in real time, as it was happening, as we were reading other events. It happened in prophecy. The prophet Daniel, in Babylon, who was there throughout the time of Babylon and into the Persian era as well. He saw it fall. Very famous handwriting on the wall event, which was handwriting, two words, a handwriting on the wall. Can be spoken of both ways. They never knew that, but the fall of that Daniel was given to see. He saw the abomination of desolation, the first one. He saw the abomination of desolation, the second one, as a matter of history, but it was prophecy to him, but with history as it was recorded. That's the only time it's actually recorded as such, other than the references also that Christ made in his time. But he was referring also to the future of the yet future abomination of desolation. The Bible is a very unique book. You can't really just sort of grab it and say, I've got it. I've got this. This is all figured out now. Because it's not just two-dimensional as in reading words on a page. There's time involved there. And time is another dimension. And you have to look at it about that 3 dimensions, and time is the 4th one. Well, you're sitting in a chair right now, and you're 3 dimensions. You've got width, and you've got depth, and you've got height. That's your 3 dimensions. Were you there an hour ago? Answer, no. So the time dimension was part of your being there. That's really a very simple. I think the movie The Time Machine, H.G. Wells used that principle. Used it to describe what his time machine was. But for Israel, they were sort of living that. They were there, then they were not. But with prophecy, it depends where in the book you are in order to be able to state, well, this is prophecy or this is history. Because for Daniel, they were both prophecy and the abomination of desolation. But for Christ, one was history. As a matter of, he said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, and Daniel, as I said, saw both of them by Christ's own admission. He did, but we can confirm it by Christ's own words. Daniel saw both of them. He wasn't just one. And the first one occurred during the Greek period, which was around one of the most amazing. It's almost funny that many historians reject what Daniel wrote, the prophecies that Daniel wrote. Their way of rejecting it was saying, well, no, Daniel couldn't have lived way back then. He had to have written it after the events because he was too accurate. That's their criticism of the Bible. What Daniel wrote was too accurate to have been written when it was. Well, we know when it was written. It was written when it was. It was prophecy. And yes, it was very accurate. Very, very accurate. But Christ was looking at it prophetically, but he was also looking at it for something that isn't yet to this day happening yet. The abomination of desolation. So in the time of the Persians happened concurrently as a matter of what we just read in Ezra and Nehemiah, that same era, because it was the Persians who brought about the return of the people of Judah. Cyrus and the other Artaxerxes, all the other kings that were involved before us and after, but eventually they all fell. And one other interesting point that's often, I mentioned that Esther became the queen of Iran, which she was. How often the people of Israel, they went into foreign countries under extremely difficult circumstances, but they did well while they were there. And that includes the Exodus, too. The reason the Pharaoh treated them so badly, started actually killing them, is because he was scared to death of them. They had grown into a multitude, and the only thing the Pharaoh knew, the only thing that was missing is that they didn't have a leader. The Pharaoh was very concerned that somewhere among them there's going to be some charismatic individual who's going to get these people to rise up and cause a revolution against him, and guess what? It happened. Not in the way that Pharaoh thought, because that revolutionary was Moses, and he was actually grown up in the palace. But the reason that Pharaoh was so afraid of them is because they'd become powerful, they had become wealthy. In the first part of that, they'd been settled in the land of Goshen. One of their own was the prime minister of the country, second only to the king or to the Pharaoh. So they grew and they multiplied and they prospered. But they were at first given economic sanctions. That's what made them into slaves. They couldn't have their businesses anymore. They couldn't own their property anymore, at least not very much. And they were made virtual slaves. It doesn't mean necessarily slavery as we think of it, but they were forced to work in a way that they really had nowhere else to go. And that becomes slavery. And that way, a lot of people are slaves in this world today. They have a job. You got to go and you got to pay the mortgage and pay the rent. You got a family to take care of and things, bills to pay and all of that. So slavery, you don't have a choice. It can become that way. But they prospered. That's the point. They were sent there by the Lord. The Lord promised to turn them into a great nation, which He did. We'll put on the link for that study, until eventually things got bad for them, only because their host was afraid of them. And the Babylonian exile was the same thing. They were taken away. We'll put on the link for Jeremiah's letter. They weren't just held there in cages or in prison. They were taken away. That's true, but they were there, able to work and to live freely and to have families, and were free to do all of that. It's plainly stated. We'll put on the link for that study. So when they returned, by the time the Babylonian Empire had fallen to the Persian, they weren't just a downtrodden people. It wasn't the same kind of an exodus. They came back. They still had their national dignity about them, even though the people who returned were not the people who left. It was 70 years later. And again, the Persians, as we said, Joseph, one of the Israelite patriarchs, became the prime minister of Egypt, while the Israelites became prisoners there eventually. Well, Daniel, the prophet, he became the prime minister of Babylon, second only to the king. They did it again. And here we're going to read of Esther, who became the queen of Persia. Over and over and over again, 3 Israelites became key members of the ruling government of those empires. There was a prime minister of Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh. There was a prime minister of Babylon, second only to the king, Nebuchadnezzar. And there was the queen. It was queen consort. It wasn't a ruling queen, but she certainly had the influence, as we will read. So again, you see that they were not just downtrodden, totally wiped out. They were punished. They had the arrogance taken out of them. I'll break the pride of your power. Nations need that having done to them for their own good in order to snap them out of the death spiral that they're making themselves into. And Israel did it many times. But you can see historically now, these are sort of like finer details as we will read them. But I thought I should mention that because it's important to realize that historically As far as Judah is concerned, the return from Babylon is the end of the Old Testament. And everything we read. The way the books of the Bible are structured, some have tried to restructure them in a certain other way, where, as we have it here, we have the history up to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then we have prophets coming up, as we'll read here, and then the other writings, the Psalms, and so on, the way those books have been arranged. But you could put the Psalms back in the time of David, because he wrote most of them, or the book of Ecclesiastes back in the time of Solomon, who wrote that, but they're arranged in the way that they are. But historically, we're done in the Old Testament as far as the return of the nation is concerned. We still got some important things to read as a matter of Purim, and how Israel never knew that, northern 10 tribes. They never knew Hanukkah. They never knew Judaism, and how that distinction is very important to make. They had no Levites. The northern tribes didn't, not faithful ones. They left or were driven out by Jeroboam, who created his own religion, national religion, because he feared that the people would go down south to Judah. And you can see now where we are and where this is going as far as history is concerned. It's filling in something that was actually happening concurrently with what we've already read. As I said, the Psalms did it, and so on like that. The prophets, as we'll read them, many of the prophets were those to the northern kingdom, those to the southern kingdom, those at the time of Jeremiah, as we'll get to, was involving the fall of Judah, which occurred 70 years before the return of the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So you can see what we're doing now is sort of amplifying what we've read up to now. And it's an important thing. Some people, as I said, there was one within the Church of God, someone who's tried to rearrange his own order of the Bible. I'm really very, very suspicious of when that tries to be done. I mean, Bible translations, they've all got their agenda, but when people try to do it and then start sort of building a church around a particular translation or a particular philosophy of a translation, the alarm bells just sort of go off in my head. You don't need to do that. I can take almost any Bible and teach daily Bible study from it. And I have. I've actually, the earliest studies were done with the NIV. That was the first Bible I ever had, just coming out of the Catholic Church. And I found out it had a few problems with its agenda, so I switched to the RSV, which is to this day my favorite Bible, my favorite reading Bible. Not the NRSV, but the RSV. But primarily for copyright reasons, I use the King James, which is also a fine Bible, which I would read anyway because you should read more than one. But I thought I should mention that. Very important as far as history is concerned, and very important as far as prophecy is concerned. Because if you can understand not only the chronology of the history, but the chronology of the prophecy, when it was stated and for what era it was stated. The abomination of desolation is very important because some people think that's already been done. Or they think that the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim Dome on the Rock in Jerusalem today is the abomination of desolation, but it's not. It can't be. Because when the Messiah said, when you see it, if you're in Jerusalem, when you see it, get out of town. If you live there, don't go back to your home to get anything. If you're a visitor, don't go to your hotel to get your things. Just get out of town as soon as you see it. And you know, a lot of people have been traveling to Jerusalem for a long time and have seen the Dome of the Rock or the Muslim presence up there or anything else. It doesn't matter. You can name just about anything. And nothing's happened because those weren't the things, obviously. It was something to do. It's been described by Daniel. I mean, we're going to get to the book of Daniel later as we're reading the prophets. But Daniel described it. It's there very plainly, but it's not in its fulfillment ultimately. But again, as Christ described it, when you see it as described by Daniel. But Daniel is speaking, as the elk started going around, it's an important thing. People want absolute black and white, cut and dried. Yes, this is absolutely the answer to their questions. I hear from those. And some of them, there are no answers. yet. We don't have absolute answers. You can guess, or you can presume to have an answer, and really you don't. I suppose if you want to be a Bible teacher and somebody asks you a question, the hardest thing to do is to say, I don't know. But really, you don't have to say you don't know. You just have to say, the Bible doesn't say. If you say that, well, then what can be wrong with that? But, if you don't happen to be teaching the Bible, well, then there's the reason people won't say it. It really amazes me how people of all nations and through all time have hijacked what it came before as a matter of the memory or of actually what happened. And you can see it today, books that were written about famous events, one on one side of the question, one on the other side. The Second World War, for example, read textbooks as they're taught, and it's like they're not even talking about the same thing. And of course, whichever nation was doing the publishing, they were of course the heroes and they were the righteous ones. And of course the other side, they published books saying the same thing, or they got their reasons for being whatever. And it just, most history, and it shocks some people, most history I believe is propaganda. It's not true. If you got more than maybe a third of it that is actually based on reality, you're doing pretty good. And the rest of it is just nonsense. But if you realize that, you can live with it because you can realize you're not going to be misled by someone who's using something that never existed to use people, manipulate people into doing something that they were never meant to do or meant to be. And it's just wrong because humans have this ego thing, that people do that. If you're a reader of Daily Bible Study, I put on This Day in History. The things I put in there make people mad. And it can be something, and I don't do it on purpose, really. People accuse me of doing. I've never done it on purpose. I just state facts. And if there's something that I know that is simply historically incorrect, even regardless of how dear millions of people may hold the fantasy to their hearts, I will publish it anyway for the simple reason of getting the facts there. And if people get mad at the truth, that's not my problem. It really is. I'm really glad that they're not within physical distance, some of them, because they really get upset. And I'm not talking about the religious part of Daily Bible Study. I'm talking about This Day in History. And the whole reason I put that on to begin with is to show the flow of history as a matter of the fulfillment of prophecy. That was the original reason. Plus, I have a love of history. But that was the primary reason. People ask, well, what do you got history on a Bible study thing? But as I've been explaining, history and prophecy are really just the same thing. It just depends on what point in time you're standing as they happen or about to happen. The abomination of desolation to Daniel were two future events. To the time of Jesus Christ, they were one historic event, one future event. And they still are to us to this day yet, because the ultimate one is going to happen just prior, if not the very day before, Christ's return. But if you didn't understand the history of the first one, but the Seleucids and the fall of the Greek Empire, and how Daniel saw those things long before they happened, so much so, and so accurately, as I said, the historians say, well, it couldn't have been written when it was. It had to have been written afterwards because he was too accurate, too right. But of course he was. But he was speaking in prophecy rather than mere history. But he could have said the very same thing. And again, that just, again, proves the point. How prophecy and how historians can say a prophet was right, but they don't believe in God and they don't believe in prophecy. So they say, well, he had to have been looking backwards. But he was looking forward in time. And again, history and prophecy, same thing. And that's the reason I put history on there. But occasionally there are things, as I said, national things that millions of people have been brainwashed as children to believe is fact, when in fact they're not true. And if I see something like that, I do go out of my way to put that on there. But it's not to get people all upset. It's just to put the truth there for those who are interested in it. And, if you're not, well, then have yourself a nice old fit, be my guest. But I can't help it. That's your attitude towards the truth. Someday you're going to have to deal with that, by the way. You cling to a lie, it's not going to get you anywhere. It really isn't. And truth is truth is truth, regardless of, history of the world, or history of religion, history of the religions of this world, the history of Christianity. Just this week, the Pope, at the present time, he has now declared that those bones under there are St. Peter, and that is an absolute crock of lies. That is not Peter. There's no way he was the first Pope. Peter would have absolutely had nothing to do with the pagan, heathen Roman religion of Ishtar and sun worship and all the rest of that. And by the way, they did kill him. They crucified him. They didn't. He wasn't their glorious religious leader. They killed him somewhere. But to suggest that he was the first pope it's almost, it was almost like hand me the air sickness bag. And I've heard of that old lie for so long, but there they were announcing it, and hundreds of millions of people, if they don't outright believe it, they just accept it, and it's just a load of nonsense. It's not true. And historically, you know that. If you read the Bible, you know that. And a lot of other things that, as I said, in history that aren't true, but they're used as propaganda to manipulate people into doing things to defend something. We must defend our this, that, or other event. We hold true to things that happened in the past, but most of those things never happened. So it's ridiculous. And someday the world's going to be cured of it. There's going to be any more of that. But until then, this is the situation. We know the end time, the greatest lies that are going to come, are going to be focused upon people who teach the truth. And we're already seeing it. Now people who teach the Bible are called haters. That's the favorite word now, haters. We teach the love and the truth of the Bible, so you're called haters for it. Or we mustn't judge people, they say. Well, God judges. The Word of God judges, and if you teach what it says, it's not an individual, the teacher, who's judging anybody. It's just the Word of God. If you're teaching the Word of God, that's what it is. That's where we're coming from. That's why we're here. And the rest of it, well, people will just have to do what they're going to do. So we'll continue today with that basis of what we know, what we've been given to read, and where we know we're yet to be done, because we still have a lot to go. But as far as history is concerned, the establishment, the return of Judah, we're done. And that notwithstanding, beginning today, the book of Esther, which occurred during the Persian era, as we read. Esther chapter 1, Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia over 127 provinces. And again, the name pronunciations there, if you listen to a dozen different people pronounce it, you'll hear a dozen different names. Practically, it's the same basis, but you can see the reason that how names are rendered into English are very different oftentimes. Even the alphabets do not have equivalent sounds. And keep in mind, the Bible was written in Hebrew, the Old Testament, and Greek in the New Testament, and Aramaic. There's quite a bit of a surprising amount of Aramaic as well, which is the Syrian northern. It's related to Hebrew, but it's its own language. It was actually the primary language of the Messiah. He lived up in there. A number of things he said, the most famous things he said actually were in Aramaic, not Hebrew. I believe it's part of the reason they had an accent. It was not just a matter of a northern accent of up in Galilee, which it had anyway, but also the Aramaic connection in that. It was very famous, my God, why have you forsaken me? When you're in dire situations and you scream out something at the height of your emotion, you do so in the language that is the very heart of yourself. And he chose to speak there in Aramaic. When he spoke another time, it was in Hebrew, because that's who he was talking to. But his own language, that in itself, is an amazing, glaring clue there, because God, of course, can understand him in any language. He spoke in the spirit of the way he spoke. But you can see that. Verse 2, that in those days, when the king Ahasuerus, and I'll spell that here as it's hyphenated in the King James. I try to follow these according to the hyphenations. It's A-S-S Has-U-E-R-U-S. Ahas, that is Ahas-U-E-Rus. So what do you get from that? And being a Canadian, I have to sort of resist putting an A on the end of that. That's sort of a little Canadian joke. The Canadians say A. I don't, for some reason. People notice that, and I've noticed it. I guess I wasn't there the day they taught that one because I just don't. I don't know why. I have to go out of my way to do it. Anyway, I don't do the basically thing. That Canadians say basically, I think, way too much. It's a word that has just been beaten to death, overused, but that's just my little problem, I guess, that bothers me. Sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia, Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. When he shewed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even after 180 days. Now to stop there, that's how long the state dinner lasted. 180 days. We're looking at 6 months there. Verse 5, and when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Now just stop there. Now I emphasize that point because of what's about to happen here. The queen, but it went on for this celebration went on for 6 months. He then had another feast for 7 days. So you can see the people really had themselves a very long party, is really what it came down to. Verse 6, where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rings, and silk, and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver, upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black and marble. And of course that was due to the richness, not of Persia alone, which is today Iran, but because of the empire, and as we read here, from India unto Ethiopia. So India is to the east of Iran, a great vast country, and all the way to Ethiopia, which is south, the biblical Ethiopia and the present-day Ethiopia. They're pretty much the same, although one is larger than the other in history, which is south of Egypt, so and following down the Nile. So it's a vast, vast area that he had in order to pay for the empire. Empires are profitable. They only last as long as they are profitable. Verse 7, and they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king. Now what does that mean, according to the state of the king? Was he just happy, or was he getting a little bit, or perhaps a lot, drunk? Verse 8, and the drinking was according to the law, none did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. So, stop, no one was forced to drink, but those who wanted to get really drunk, no one stopped them. Verse 8, also Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to shew the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore the king was very wroth, and his anger burned in him. I'll stop there. Why? Vashti was the queen. She was a public figure. She was seen by the people as a normal part of her being the queen. What's the problem here? Why should she refuse to appear, even though it was not a stated state reason he wanted to display her beauty? But what was the reason? Was it simply because she refused to be used in that way? Well, some people translate it and think that it implies that he was, first of all, drunk, as it said here, merry with wine. That he demanded that she appear not wearing her royal crown, but wearing only her royal crown. And she refused to do it. And the stated context of it, many people believe that. I think there's a really strong possibility that's the reason it was. There was no other reason. It wasn't as though they were having a party and the queen wasn't, because she was having one too. But maybe she didn't want to be called away from her own party. Maybe that was it. But she refused to go. And if you look at the context of it, it's just something to consider. Verse 13, Then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment. And stop there to think that this was a matter of law. But anyway, verse 14, And the next unto him was Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meresh, Mar, Sina, Meshmukan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat the first in the kingdom. So there's the 7 highest rulers under the emperor. This was a matter because the queen refused to appear. Now, it's a pretty important thing. He made a very important thing out of this. It wasn't a matter of a man having a disagreement with his wife and they settle it themselves, discussing what the problem was and hopefully finding a solution, but making it an official state problem, bringing in the entire country, the rulers of the entire country. And what did they say? Verse 15, What shall we do unto the queen Vashti, according to law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? And the chamberlains there were, of course, eunuchs. They were in charge of the queen's people, not only the queen, but her entire part of the palace. Many ladies in waiting, as it was called. Verse 16, And Memucan answered before the king, And the princess Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. So stop there. They've made it into really a matter of unpatriotic act of treason by her refusing to appear before the crown. Now, keep in mind there was a state reason that the queen appeared before the people. Imagine any monarch or any president or prime minister or his wife or her husband that refused to appear in public. You could see there would be something else strange. And there's sort of a point in there somewhere, but that was not the point here. She refused to appear at a drunken party wearing a crown and perhaps wearing only her royal crown. So it wasn't just a matter of something quite normal. But you can understand why it would be very strange. Imagine if the spouse of the leader of your country refused to appear in public. Would you think there was something strange about that? Even though that's not what she was doing here. She apparently only did it once, and that was at that party. Anyway, verse 17, For this deed of the queen shall come abroad to all women. Maybe here's the reason. So that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, when it shall be reported the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Stop there. There's the reason, isn't it? They made it a matter of control. It was not a matter of state. It affected the country. It affected every man in the country, apparently, but it was not a matter of really any kind of a state threat or a matter of patriotism. It was a matter of, well, as we read. Verse 18, Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen. Thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. I'm surprised, just to mention here, this probably makes some people mad, that many of the radical feminists don't use this as an example. I've never heard it used in that way, but it certainly could be used in that way, couldn't it? Particularly if the part about wearing the crown only is correct. And it is speculation there, but I think within the context, a drunken party, and you wouldn't normally make such a demand on someone. And he was obviously lusting for beauty, as he plainly said there, to have the people, and so on. So it was another, it's a possibility. I think there's more here than is written, but we'll have to settle for what we're given, and which is well enough. Anyway, verse 19, if it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it not be altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus. Let the king give her royal estate to another that is better than she. So stop. They declared a divorce for the king, right there, for the queen's refusal to do what she was demanded to do, whatever that in detail had turned out to be, or was. Verse 20, and when the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give their husbands honor, both to great and small. And again, all the way from India, across the entire Middle East, through the land of Israel, down into Egypt and down into Ethiopia. It was quite an order, wasn't it? That entire incident became known across that vast area. It wasn't just something that happened within the palace. And as we'll see, the result of it, when we get to Esther here, the result of it, the becoming of Purim and a national holiday of Jews all around the world, you can see that one incident carried along historic shadow. One could also speculate, and people do, whether that would have mattered, because was this happening? Would this have prevented we're going to read in the book of Esther, the saving of the nation? Was this before or after the return by Ezra and Nehemiah? And if it was after, and keeping in mind they were still under, even though they returned, they were still under this Persian empire, Persian emperor, under this very man. So it would have affected them in that way anyway. But things such as Purim, people ask that, well, do Christians observe Purim? Well, you do if you're a Jewish Christian, because it is a matter of a holy day or holiday specific to the history of the people of Judah. It does not affect Christians as a matter, although Christ very likely observed it. It does not state specifically by name. There are allusions to it, but we know he observed Hanukkah, which is a specific date in the history of Judah, but which implies, which, as we said, is going to be very Christian, because it's the one event that's going to happen just prior to within the day of Christ's return. So that's pretty Christian there as a matter of that one. Purim is a matter of the saving of the people of Judah. Does that have a Christian connection? Well, if it would have affected the birth of the Messiah or his ancestors, then yes, there would be a reason for that. Some people say the book of Esther doesn't even belong in the Bible because there's no mention of the Lord. But does it have the connection to the Messiah is again the heart of the matter. That's the question. And if it does, and I think it does, that's the reason it's there. It wouldn't be there otherwise. There has to be a reason for it. And whether people say, well, man put it in there, and man did this, man did that. Well, the Lord tolerated it at the very least. And if it was something that distracts from the people of the Church of God following the truth, then I think it wouldn't have been there, allowed to be in there. There's all kinds of things that we recognize as not belonging in the Bible that a lot of people would like to put there. A lot of the Bibles have it, but it doesn't have any effect upon what we are doing and what we know. But does it have a Christian connection? Does Purim? That's the heart of the question. If you want to look for a loose thread, loose thread thing, that would be it. Is there a Christian connection or a messianic connection of Purim? The saving of, and not only the observance of it, but the saving of the people of Judah. Because it affected not only the people in Iran, but the people throughout the empire, which at that time included what Ezra and Nehemiah were doing back in the land of Israel. Then what Purim really did was legally empower the people of Judah to defend themselves. That's really what it came down to. I'm sure Ezra and Nehemiah would have been very happy to hear that law. They wouldn't have been happy to hear the death declaration, but they would have been very happy to put it in law, as we'll read, that the people of Judah had a right to defend their lives. They had a right to be armed. to defend themselves. So, and that was a good thing for them to reestablish the kingdom so the Messiah could be born there centuries later. So, did it have a connection? Well, in a way it must have. Verse 21, and the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of me, Mukan. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. And again, that's speaking in tongues, the real meaning of it. But the decree was issued throughout in the entire empire, and all the languages of the empire, all the tongue of the empire. And what it was, in effect, was a divorce decree and a warning. If you do the same, then really what it came down to was a divorce law. To be a new divorce law enforced throughout not only the palace or the king's life, his own personal life, but the entire nation and the entire empire. So it was a very, very big event. And it might have been something that was based upon drunkenness. Somebody got drunk, made an outrageous demand, and look at the result of it. And as we said in our introduction, the history is like that sometimes. You can look at the so-called glorious history of one nation or another, but oftentimes the root event is based upon something that either didn't happen, or it did happen, it was just some minor little thing that was been built up and built up and built up generation after generation, not to really make the original individual heroic, but to make the people who were making up the lie heroic, because they carried on from there. But you can see what this turned into. From a drunken party came a law, a divorce law, that was enforced all the way from India to Ethiopia, across 2 entire continents. Esther chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Herge the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women. Let their things for purification be given them. Interestingly, there as well, he was seeking a new wife, they all felt sorry for him, right? So they wanted to get a new wife for him. But notice they sought not a foreigner from somewhere out in the empire, but someone within their own kingdom. And just consider the irony of that, because they ended up choosing a foreign woman, a woman of Judah, or Benjamin as we'll read, which is the kingdom of Judah, the religion of Judah later on. She was a Benjamite, but a Jew by kingdom. We'll put the link on for that. It's the same reason that the Apostle Paul sometimes called himself a Jew and sometimes called himself a Benjamite. I'll put on the link for that. Verse 4, and let the maidens which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. And again, as we explained, the tribes of Israel were all that they were. They were individual tribes. The tribe of Benjamin was independent of the tribe of Judah. But when Israel split into Israel and Judah, the tribes of Benjamin and Judah and the Levites that were there formed the kingdom of Judah. And when they were taken away, Jews and Benjamites both were taken away. But they were all called Jews as a matter of their nationality. And when they returned, what developed later on, after the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the religion that was developed by the Pharisees and Sadducees, that became the religion of Judah and Benjamin and Levi. Most of the faithful Levites moved from the north, the lost 10 tribes, down to Judah. Again, it's another major difference religiously between Israel and Judah. There were no Levites, no faithful ones. Verse 6, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jehoniah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And again, stop. There's the connection between Christ's family. If they'd have been all wiped away, you see now, there's a clue, if not the very reason itself, why we're reading the book of Esther. It hasn't to do with Purim as a holiday that's been celebrated by the Jews ever since, and it's their holiday, Jews and Benjamites, but as a matter of what was the Christian connection. And I think it's very plain what that is. Verse 7, and he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house for the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And again, you can see that the subtle point, as we said, he didn't look throughout the empire for a wife, he looked within his kingdom. He was looking for an Iranian wife, a Persian wife, and he ended up with a foreign woman who was there as one of the captives. And the reason for that, if you think that all just happened of its own, of itself, or whether the Lord's hand was in this, because it empowered the entire nation of Judah from that time on. It also made them favorable, the people of Judah favorable to the governments of Iran, which is completely different than it is today. Verse 9, and the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to be given her out of the king's house, and he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Esther had not shewed her people, nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not shew it. And again, you can see there, they knew what they were doing. They were slipping in a foreign, I almost said foreign agent, but really that's what it came to be, considering what she was able to do. Mordecai knew what he was doing. He was able to do that, whether he was looking ahead to something that he saw coming, because obviously with Haman, the hostility was obviously there, anti-Judaism. But continuing, verse 11, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did, and how and what should become of her. Now when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, that after that she had been 12 months according to the manner of the women, so were the days of their purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months of oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of women, and stopped there. Why was he doing that? Was there a reason? Some obviously see that it was like a time of quarantine in which someone, before they could become a king's consort or concubine or queen, was required to wait a year and just to see whether or not there were any illnesses that would become there. It was like a quarantine period. It was more than just a matter of frilly things and perfuming. It was a matter of waiting to see whether they were healthy or not. The women then were obviously treated like animals or cattle or property, and there's no nicer way to put that. It's just the reality of the way it was then. And the fact that something good and strong came out of it as a matter for the people of Judah and of the Messiah. Again, the book wouldn't be there otherwise. There's no reason for it to be there otherwise, other than it's a historic book of how the people of Judah and Benjamin came to observe Purim, but you can see the point. Verse 13, then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given to her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women to the custody of Shushagate, Shaashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines, and came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. Can you think of a king of Israel that did that? The same thing. Solomon did the same thing. Greatly corrupted by it. This man obviously was a lustful, immoral, unfaithful individual. And that just shows how power corrupts. The same power corrupts. Verse 15, now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king. She required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And again, you see, there's a point there as well. If you look for it, there was a racism thing. Well, we hate Jews, but the people, until they found out someone was a Jew, they didn't hate them. They could love one, but if they find out they're a Jew, well then I hate you. You can say I love you, but if you're a Jew, I hate you. But it's the very same individual. And you see there just how ridiculous racism is. It's not who you are, it's what you do. What you choose to do once you know better. Verse 18, Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast, and he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. So there he was throwing another great celebration. He was apparently one very big for that. Verse 19, And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet shewed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. And again, you can see the anti-Semitism, but that word is actually not correct. It's not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Judaism, because a lot of the people who think they hate Jews today in the world are in fact themselves Israelites. They're of the lost 10 tribes. Many of them, I'm certain of it. They claim to be Christian today, and yet they think they hate Jews, but they're hating. And aren't they going to have a surprise one day when they realize and discover that they're not from this country or that country or this country, but they're going to go back to Israel and find out who they really were. And it's like another Exodus in which the people who left were not the people who returned. That happened a number of times. Their stay in Egypt was the first major one. The return from the Babylonian exile is another one. And the gathering of Israel and Judah in the yet future is another really big one, far bigger. And even the dry bones prophecy of Ezekiel 37, all the things that are there are a lot of surprises coming. A lot of people are going to really realize. We hear this every once in a while. There was a man actually in Europe I read. He was like 60 years old. He'd been a hate-filled individual, thought he hated Jews. He was almost a Nazi, or the equivalent of it, whatever that was, in Eastern Europe, until he found out that he was a Jew by ancestry. Genetically, he was a Jew. And he's gone from a Jew-hating and Jew-killing, if he could have gotten away with it, I'm sure, to this, he's become a very observant Orthodox Jew. He's become somebody who he thought he hated. And again, and that just happened. You just read about that in the news just recently. And people have that happen. He's still not ahead, by the way, because he's adopted Judaism rather than Christianity, which is he gave away apparently his Christianity to become a Jew. And you don't need to do that, but you can see the point. He discovered he was a Jew, so he adopted Judaism. And the Christianity that he had before was the Church of Rome. He was really no better. Religiously, he's no better off, although he's gotten rid of the hate in his heart, so that's certainly better off. And at least with Judaism, he's closer to the Sabbath and the holy days, even though he doesn't yet realize what they are. We don't observe, by the way, the Jewish holy days. We observe the Lord's holy days. We don't observe the Jewish Sabbath. We observe the Lord's Sabbath, and for reasons we've explained. Verse 21, In those days, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. And keep that in mind, because that little bit of history that they recorded there is going to come up later on. But he was a loyal, despite the fact that he was being held captive. And again, as we said, the people of Judah, when they were taken away into captivity, they weren't just put in prisons and left in jail cells or made into slaves. They were there to prosper. They were able to prosper, to live and have families and own property and work and have businesses and do all those things. As stated by Jeremiah, for them to do that, they were actually commanded to do that by the Lord, so that they would be a prosperous people when they return. Unlike the people of what happened to the Israelites in Egypt, they entered as a family of 70 people. They were property owners. They were given to live in the best part of the land up in Goshen, the rich Nile Delta up in there. The prime minister was one of their own. He was the executive of the government. He was practically the king in many ways. The only time the Pharaoh did anything is when he was really became a figurehead. The actual ruler of the country was Joseph, who was an Israelite. But 4 centuries later, because they'd prospered so much, the later Pharaoh, feared them, so he began persecuting, limiting their economic opportunities, rendering them into slaves. And when that still didn't work, because he feared, and really all they needed was a leader. Someone like a Joshua, at that time, and I'm surprised, and maybe he did, could have risen up because they were being treated like slaves, brutally abused and afflicted, and then they began killing their children, and yet they still didn't raise up. They still took it. And it just shows the state. And it wasn't because they weren't strong. The reason the Pharaoh was doing it is because they were strong. And they were obviously doing all the hard labor, so they were physically fit. They were very prolific in increasing their numbers, which is again the reason the Pharaoh feared them. They were increasing in number. And, they could have had a revolution. You could take a hoe and turn it into a weapon. And they didn't. And the difference there, when they came out, is the reason they never made the journey complete. When they saw the opportunity to go in, they wanted to go back to Egypt instead. Whereas the generation that returned from the Babylonian exile, they didn't have that problem. They weren't gone as long, but they nevertheless didn't have that particular problem. Thank you for joining us for services this week. As always, your being with us makes our joy complete. Until next week, when we meet again on this, God's holy Sabbath day, may the Lord bless thee and keep thee. May the Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. God bless you all.